Hello, everybody, and welcome to my anatomy project. My name is Mandy, and I am in my 300-hour RYT, and my anatomy project is the skeletal system and yoga. Okay, so our skeleton is the framework of our body. It holds everything together. So our skeleton is made up of bones. There are 206 bones within our skeleton. There's also cartilage and ligaments. Those are the three main components that make up our skeletal system. So bones, what are bones made of? So the outer surface of a bone is called the periosteum. So the periosteum is a thin, dense membrane, and it contains nerves, blood vessels, and those nerves and blood vessels nourish the bone. So the next layer of the bone is made up of compact bone, and that is smooth and very hard. This is the part that we see when we look at the skeleton. So when we look at this picture, that is the second part, the very hard bone that we're seeing. Within the compact bone, there's many layers of calcareous bone, and those look a bit sponge-like. So calcareous bone is not as hard as compact bone, and but it's still very, very strong. So in many bones, the calcareous bone protects the innermost part of the bone, which is your bone marrow. And bone marrow is sort of a thick jelly-like substance. And the bone marrow's job is to make blood cells. What are the functions of the skeletal system as a whole? So as we had said, it's the framework of our bodies. It holds us together. So it supports us. The bones carry all of the weight of our body. So they're made to carry all of the weight of our body, which is pretty impressive. Protection. The bones act as almost like a suit of armor. They protect our most vital organs. So think if we didn't have bones, our organs would just be exposed to anything, any elements or anything that could harm them. So movement, the body is built to move with the help of muscles attached to bones that pull on the bones to move the body. Also mineral homeostasis. So bones store calcium and phosphorus, and those two are released into the blood whenever they are needed. So it keeps the homeostasis. Blood cell production. Red bone marrow, which remember is that innermost part of your bone, produces red and white blood cells and other blood elements. And the last function of the skeletal system is storage. So yellow bone marrow stores fats, otherwise known as lipids, and minerals. Okay, so what are the types of bones? Now that we know what bones are made of, what are the different types? And this is a good little diagram here. It shows the different types. So we have flat bones, long bones, short bones. We have irregular bones, and we have something called a sesamoid bone, a very small bone. So let's talk about those five. So flat bones. Flat bones are somewhat flattened like a shield that protect organs. So examples of flat bones would be the sternum, the scapula, and the pelvis. Then we have long bones. Long bones support the weight of the body and facilitate movement. So we think about our femur, tibia, and our humerus bones. So our leg bones and our arm bone. Then we have short bones. So short bones are located in the wrists and the ankles, and they provide stability and some movement. So examples are our carpals and our tarsals. And those are our wrists and our ankles. So then we have something known as an irregular bone. So irregular bones, those vary in shape and structure, and they do not fit into any of the other categories. So they have complex shapes, and they also help to protect internal organs. And examples of these types of irregular bones would be the vertebrae, which you see pictured here, the vertebrae of the spine, and the bones of the pelvis. The last type is the sesamoid bone. So these are very small bones. Those are embedded in tendons and they protect tendons from stress and wear. And they're called the sesamoid because they're like known to be so, so small, like sesame seed. Examples, they're really not that small, but examples are the patella and bones found in the tendons of hands, knees, and feet. So those are the types of bones. All right, there are two sections of our skeletal system. So we have the axial skeleton and we have the appendicular skeleton. So the skeletal system, they're divided in those two distinct sections. And the axial skeleton consists of the bones of the skull, the spinal vertebrae, along with the sacrum and coccyx, ribs, sternum, and hyoid bone. And I'm going to show you a picture of this in a second, and we're going to delve deeper into that skeleton. Then we have the appendicular skeleton, and that consists of all the other bones that are not in the center of the body. And the appendicular skeleton, those come in pairs. So we will also delve deeper into the appendicular skeleton. So first, let's look at the axial. So the axial skeleton are the bones that you see in the turquoise color here. Once again, the skull, the laryngeal skeleton, the vertebral column, and the thoracic cage. You know, that's where your sternum and your ribs are. So let's talk a little bit more about the axial skeleton. Okay, so the axial skeleton again consists of the skull. So your skull contains quite a few bones. So the skull has 22 bones in total. There are 8 bones in the cranium, and those are the bones that surround the brain. There are 14 bones in the facial area. And then located at the center of the brow behind the frontal lobe is your 6th chakra, your Anja chakra. And this chakra is the seat of wisdom and intuition. So I wanted to put that in there as well, since our chakras are so important to us in our practice. Next part of our axial skeleton, the spine. So the spine is our backbone and it protects the spinal cord. The entire spine works together to move the body. So the spine is made up of 24 vertebrae. And as we know, that's 7 in the cervical spine, 12 in the thoracic, 5 in the lumbar. Then there is the sacral spine, which are 5 fused vertebrae. And then we have the coccyx or the tailbone, which are 3 to 5 fused vertebrae. So that's what makes up the spine. Moving on, we have the ribs. Ribs are made up, there are 24 ribs or 12 pairs. And then it's also categorized by true ribs and false ribs. So ribs 1 through 7 are true ribs because they articulate directly to the sternum. So they're attached directly to the sternum. But ribs 8 through 12 are not attached directly to the sternum. So those are known as false ribs. And our sternum, what we're talking about here is our breastbone. We also call that where we take namaskar, our heart center, located in the middle of our chest. The sternum consists of the manubrium, the body of the sternoid, and the sternum, and the exvoid process. Some of these words are tricky. Okay, the hyoid bone, the last section, that's where we saw in the laryngeal skeleton. That's where the hyoid bone is located. And that is part of the laryngeal bone. The main job of this bone is to anchor the tongue, and it is located at the root of the tongue on the anterior or front of the neck. All right, let's move on to the appendicular skeleton. So again, this skeletal system is notated in a turquoise color. So we have the shoulder girdle, we have the upper limbs, the pelvic girdle, and the lower limbs. So again, what it said was that these skeleton pieces, they would come in pairs. So 2 arms, 2 sides of your pelvis, 2 legs, 2 shoulder blades. Um, so this is a different type, definitely, than the axial. The axial was much more about stability, and this is about stability, but this is really about movement. So let's look deeper into the appendicular skeleton. Okay, so again, shoulder. So that's known as the shoulder girdle, and that consists of the scapula, which we also call shoulder blades, and the clavicle bones, which are our collarbones. So then we also have our upper limbs. So those are the bones of the arm, the humerus, and the forearm, the radius, and the ulna. We have bones of the wrists. Those consist of 8 carpal bones, and hands. That includes 8 bones in the wrist, 5 bones in the palm, 14 bones that form fingers and thumb. So a lot of bones in our wrist and hand. The proximal, which is closer to the torso, end of the ulna is a bony protrusion called the olecranon. That's also known as our elbow. Then we have the pelvis. So the pelvic girdle, that's a ring of bones attached to the vertebral column, and that connects the bones of the lower limbs to the axial skeleton. The pelvic girdle consists of right and left hip bones, and each hip bone is large, flattened, and irregularly shaped. Remember, it was one of the irregular bones. And it is a fusion of 3 bones: the ilium, the ischium, and the pubis bones. The last section of the appendicular skeleton are the lower limbs. And those are the bones of the thigh or the femur, and the leg, which is made up of the tibia and fibula, and then the foot. So the tarsal bones of the ankle and the phalanges that form the toes, and the metatarsals that give the foot the arch. Okay. Now let's move on to joints. So joints hold your skeleton together and support your movement. So your bones have joints. All of your bones have joints. So there are different joint types. Just like there were different bone types, there's different joint types. We have fibrous joints, cartilaginous joints, and synovial. And it's going to show over here on the side, fibrous, no movement; cartilaginous, some movement; synovial, full movement. So let's see, fibrous. Fibrous bones joined by fibrous connective tissue, and that allows for very little movement. So examples are sockets of the teeth and the skull sutures. And the skull sutures are what you see pictured here on the skull, those lines that are going down the skull. Those are the sutures of the skull. Then we have the cartilaginous joints, and those are formed with hyaline cartilage, which allows for limited movement. So examples of that are connection of the ribs to the sternum, and then the disc joints of the vertebrae. The last joint type, synovial, that is a joint capsule where synovial fluid is produced that keeps the joints lubricated. And since they are lubricated, they move smoothly. So there's full movement in the synovial joint. So since the synovial joint is the joint of full movement, there are 6 types of movement or mobility in those joints, and they are pictured here. So let's go through all of them and go ahead and take a look at the picture as I go through them, because they're quite interesting. So ball and socket. So the ball and socket, there's a rounded head of a long bone or a ball that fits into a concave depression of another bone or a socket. And those freely moving joints that they can rotate on any axis. So examples would be the hip joint and the shoulder joints. So those are ball and socket. A hinge joint. A hinge moves on one axis or sagittal plane and allows for flexion and extension. So examples of this would be, extending or flexing your elbow or your knee. Then we have gliding. A gliding joint allows for a wide range of motion in a gliding movement. So example of that would be your patella or your kneecap. If you stick your leg out in front of you, you can move your kneecap or your patella from side to side. Okay, a pivot joint formed when one bone rotates or twists around another bone. So example of this is how the radius wraps around the ulna, and that's known as the radial joint. So when the radius wraps around the ulna. The next one is a saddle joint. A saddle joint allows for flexion, extension, and other movements, but no rotation there. So example is your thumb. You can't rotate your thumb joint, but you can flex and extend it. The last one is the condyloid. The condyloid allows for circular motion, flexion, and extension. So examples of this are your wrist joint between the radius and the carpal bones, because you can circle your wrists, and your ankles. You could do that with your ankles as well. Okay, so explaining the types of joint actions or movements, because we did mention flexion and extension, things like that. So going over that as a refresher quickly. Flexion, that's bending or decreasing the angle of a joint. So your bones essentially move closer together. Example, bending the elbow or bending the knee. Extension would be straightening or increasing the angle of a joint. So your bones move further away from one another. And that would be example of straightening the arm, straightening the leg. Abduction. Abduction would be moving an arm or leg laterally, so out to the sides of the body, away from your center, away from your midline. Example of this could be star pose, even goddess pose. Let's see, adduction. Adduction is moving an arm or leg away from the sides towards the midline of the body. So example is Garudasana or eagle pose. We're moving our limbs towards the midline. The last is rotation, and pure rotation only occurs in the spine. So medial and lateral rotation refers to movements in the shoulders and hips, and medial is when the bone turns along the axis towards the midline of the body, but lateral is when the bone turns along its axis away from the midline of the body. So just a refresher on what these movements or joint actions that they are. Let's move on. Okay, a refresher here on the planes of the body, because I did mention that as well. And this picture does a good job at showing, how the body is essentially cut in sections. The first would be the sagittal plane. And that is a vertical line, and that divides the body into a left and a right section. The coronal plane, that's a vertical line which divides the body into a front. Remember, front means anterior section and a back or posterior section. And the last plane is the transverse plane, and that is a horizontal line, and that divides the body into an upper or a superior section and a lower or inferior section. So those are the planes of the body. Now I want to talk about a couple more joints in a little bit more detail, because they are a little more complicated. So the first would be the pelvis joint. And I liked this picture because it made it pretty easy to see the different sections of the pelvis. And I liked how it was color coded as well. So the sacroiliac joint, the SI joint, easier to say SI, joins the ilium and the sacrum and attaches the pelvis to the spine. So you can see where the ilium and the sacrum are located, the yellow and the turquoise here. Okay, now this one here, acetobulofemoral joint. That is a hip joint and ball and socket joint of the pelvis. And that connects the proximal head of the femur to the acetabulum, the concave depression in the hip. The socket of the acetabulum forms at the joining together of the ilium, pubis, and ischium, and which are the three bones that make up the pelvis. And you can see those three bones right there in that picture. Then we have the pubis symphysis, and that joins the pubis bones, but it does not provide much movement. Next, the pelvis functions. So the functions of the pelvis, it transfer of weight from the upper axial skeleton to the lower appendicular components of the skeleton. So especially during movement. So it provides attachment for a number of muscles and ligaments used in movement. We have a lot of movement in our pelvis and our hips, especially in yoga. Our alignment, a lot of our alignment has to do with that area of our body. There are three different pelvic positions. So we have a neutral, a posterior tilt, and an anterior tilt. So first, the neutral. That is when your pelvic bowl is balanced with a neutral lumbar curve. So not a deep curve, just a neutral lumbar. Posterior tilt, that's when your pelvic bowl is tilted backwards. So that's when we have a flattened lumbar curve. And the last pelvic position is anterior tilt. And that would be when the pelvic bowl is tilted forward, and that's exaggerating our lumbar curve. All right, the next joint I want to talk about is the shoulder joint. So the shoulder is a glenohumeral joint. And you can see that if you look closely. I believe it's on there. So that's a ball and socket joint where the head of the humerus meets the glenoid fossa, which is the depression of the scapula. Then we have our acromyoclavicular joint, and that's where the distal head of the clavicle, which again, that's our collarbone, and the acromion process of the scapula meet. And you can see that for sure in this picture here. Then we have the sternoclavicular joint, and that joins the proximal head of the clavicle with the topmost portion of the sternum. And this is the shoulder's only connection to the axial skeleton, which is interesting. Okay, we have another joint here, our knee joint. So our knee joint is made up of the patellofemoral joint, and that's the patella, remember your kneecap, slides along the groove of the anterior distal head of the femur. Then we have the tibiofemoral joint, and that is the femur articulating with the proximal head of the tibia. Then we have the ligaments of the knee. They're great stabilizers and they keep the knee really strong. So the four different ligaments are the anterior cruciate ligament, and we call that the ACL. I'm sure everybody's heard of, oh, I tore my ACL or something happened to my ACL. Well, that's what they're talking about. That is a particular ligament of the knee joint. We have the posterior cruciate ligament, your PCL, the medial collateral ligament, the MCL, and the lateral collateral ligament, or the LCL. And that is the knee joint. All right, so we also have the connective tissues that make up our bones and our skeletal system. So the connective tissues, those are strong, flexible tissues that connect, secure, and cushion your joints. And the three main types of connective tissues are ligaments, which we just talked about, the knee ligaments, tendons, and cartilage. So what are these different items here? The ligaments, again, connect the bone of a joint, bone to bone, and they have very little flexibility. So when somebody says, I tore my ACL, that doesn't have much flexibility. It takes a really long time for something like that to heal. There's not a lot of movement in a ligament. So they are meant to stabilize and keep things connected on a very deep level. Then we have a tendon. A tendon connects muscle to bone, and they're not meant to be stretched, but they do give a little more in terms of contracting and lengthening. So a little bit more movement than definitely a ligament would be able to give. So then we have cartilage. Cartilage cushions the bone of the joint, but it's a very firm tissue, but is softer and much more flexible than a bone. The cartilage, you can feel it in your nose, in different area, like in your ear. So a lot more flexible than your bone, obviously. And then we have bursa. You can see the bursa here. It's that kind of oblong circle we have. And that is small sacs that contain synovial fluid. They reduce the friction of articulating bones and they provide cushion and mobility to your joint. So this picture here will give you a visual for some of the items that I just talked about. Okay. How do our bones change over time? So when we are born, we have roughly 300 bones in our body. And then as we get older, these bones fuse together and we have a total of 206 bones in our body in adulthood. So I found that very interesting. I knew we were much more, you know, cartilaginous when we were born, but I didn't know it went down that dramatically with the amount of bones we have in our body. So by age 30, our bone density peaks and the body no longer lays down new bone. So as it quickly breaks it down. So bone loss normally begins around this time, even if we don't have any symptoms, obviously, or know it at the age of 30, that's our peak of bone density. So the body breaks down and builds up bone in a constant flux, and that affects bone mass or density in our body. So while some bone loss is natural with aging, it is possible to maintain a healthy equilibrium, which is a balance of bone destruction and reconstruction. So not everyone is going to, experience bone loss on the same level. So if there is a much greater loss than gain, that's when bone deterioration, otherwise known as osteoporosis, can develop. So let's talk a little bit more about osteoporosis. Okay, so osteoporosis. So I like this picture because it really does give you a good idea of what happens, like how the bone loss occurs. Looks a lot more um, like a sponge, I guess, or like a loofah sponge almost, how it has irregular openings. And then in our healthy bone, it's much more regular. So osteoporosis occurs when the creation of new bone does not keep up with the loss of old bone. As people age, bone mass is lost faster than it is created. So a number of factors can increase the likelihood that you could develop osteoporosis: age, race, lifestyle choices, medical conditions, and treatments or medications that you might be taking. So, the National Institute of Health estimates that 10 million Americans have osteoporosis and another 34 million have osteopenia, which is low bone mass. And that is also a precursor to osteoporosis. And then 80% of those with osteoporosis are women. So there are ways to prevent. So prevention of osteoporosis, you need to make sure you have good calcium intake, good vitamin D intake, balanced body weight, so not being too thin or too overweight, and to make sure that you are exercising as part of a daily routine. Some also believe that a plant-based diet, while getting, your adequate amounts of protein, obviously, may be a preventative tool as well. And then, of course, yoga. So, diet and lifestyle. So, calcium rich vegetables, that's kale and spinach, and there's a lot more. So, you don't have to just take, a calcium supplement, obviously, or drink milk. You can get calcium in many other types of foods. You want to try and limit processed foods from your diet, limiting. Ooh, What's going on? There we go. I do not know what just happened there. So, limiting animal products in our diets. So, research shows that too much protein in a diet may actually weaken bone because protein is acid forming. So, when there's too much acid that enters the bloodstream, the body starts to pull the calcium, which is alkaline. So, it wants to neutralize that acid. So, that's why it starts to pull that calcium out of the bone. Okay, so fruits and vegetables. Fruits and vegetables neutralize the acid from protein in our diets as well. So that's why a lot of people think that plant-based diet is the way to go. And what is important though is really your ratio of intake of fruits and vegetables to the intake of animal protein. And that's how you're really going to have a balanced diet. And then packing your diet with alkaline rich fruits and keeping acidic foods to a minimum will help keep your bones healthy and strong. And there's different types of plant-based diets that you can see here. It says that about 40% of Americans are shifting towards eating more plant-based foods. So you could be fully plant-based, you could be a flexitarian, which is plant-based but, occasionally having eggs, dairy and meat. Vegetarian, plant-based excludes any sort of animal flesh. Lacto-ovo, vegetarian, but you do eat dairy and eggs. Pescatarian, which is a vegetarian but does eat seafood. Or a vegan, so no animal food, and vitamin B12 needs to be included in that diet plan. And there's a lot of other resources to look up all of these different types of diets. So, how does yoga help our bones? I liked this little cartoon here. It's quite funny. So, yoga can definitely help with bone loss. And there is a study that was done by Lauren Fishman. So, he's an assistant clinical professor at the Columbia College of Physicians and Surgeons in New York and the co-author of Yoga for Osteoporosis. So he conducted a study in 2009 on the link between bone loss and yoga. So what he did was he enrolled 18 people with osteoporosis or osteopenia, and the average age of the participants was 68. And everyone had a baseline bone density test at the start of his experiment, I guess you can call it. So while 7 people acted as the control group, 11 others learned a sequence that included 10 yoga postures, including Trikonasana, which is triangle pose, um, let's see, downward and upward facing dog, and bridge pose. So it was let's see, 10 different yoga postures, and those were just a couple of them. So the participants stayed in each pose for 20 to 30 seconds because research suggests that roughly 10 seconds of stimulation is enough to trigger new bone growth. And the daily yoga routine took them about 10 minutes. So way over what research is suggesting. So Dr. Fishman charted both groups' progress. And then 2 years later, he asked everyone to get another bone scan. And the results were published in the journal of Topics in Geriatric Rehabilitation, and they were promising results. So while near every member of the control group maintained or lost bone, around 85% of the yoga practicing group gained bone in the spine and the hips. And he said, I was shocked at the results. By putting tremendous pressure on the bones without harming the joints, yoga may be the answer to osteoporosis. And that's pretty amazing. Okay, so how does yoga help our bones and our ligaments? And I really like this guy too here. Hello, my name is Yoga and I will change your life. And I think we all know this to be true. So, yoga strengthens our skeleton when practiced on a regular basis. And all of the yoga standing poses are strengthening to our legs and our spinal bones, while holding our body on our hands strengthens our arms. So, sun salutations, those are beneficial to every bone in your body, which, why not do some sun salutations in our practice. Absolutely. For anyone who has spent time off of their feet through an illness or injury, yoga can be a great way to regain that bone strength as part of a recovery plan. So for that, gentle restorative poses at first, and then you can build up to more challenging and dynamic work as your rehab progresses. As we change positions through our asana practice, our joints are being pumped with nourishment. So that's a plus as well. Yoga is also a great way to manage any joints with degenerative changes or osteoarthritis, as it nourishes the worn out cartilage and strengthens the muscles around the joint. Both of which of these will really help to reduce pain, which is something that a lot of people talk about when they have any sort of arthritis. And then yoga is great for your skeletal health. So, roll out that mat and let's increase your mind, body, and soul connection while increasing your bone density and cartilage nutrients. Um, you can't go wrong. So let's rev up that asana practice for sure. Okay, so knowing your skeleton. So that's important because I learned so much about our skeleton. I also knew quite a bit from all of my yoga training, but it's important for everybody to know your skeleton. So bones are living tissues and respond to healthy stress of weight bearing and adequate compression. Therefore, it is important to move them and place them in ways that allow them to remain strong, supple, and healthy. And I firmly believe that if yoga practitioners had a working knowledge of how the human skeleton was designed to move, there would be a lower rate of both on and off the mat injuries. And this is Jenna Lee Tonner, and she is with Eckhart Yoga. And then I just think that this is a really fun little snippet here. Know your skeleton, the number of bones in adults, number of bones in neonates or when you're born, your face, your skull, your hand, your wrist, your foot, ear, spine, neck, and ribs. Just really kind of interesting information about how many bones we have in different parts of our body. Okay, so how important is alignment in yoga practice? It's very important. So back bends. So in a back bend, so if you drop your head back in back bends like cobra, upward facing dog, and crescent lunge, you're most likely dumping in your lower back or compressing and causing tension, discomfort, pain, or injury. So we want to make sure we are correctly going into our back bends. Twists, different twists such as half Lord of the Fishes, revolve triangle pose. So keeping the ilium and the sacrum anchored to the floor rather than allowing movement with the twist of the spine. So like turning your torso increases the risk of injury to the bones of the spine. So those are your discs, remember, between the vertebrae and ligaments that connect the vertebrae. So again, very important to be in correct alignment when in a twist. And again, so the alignment in yoga. So trying to force the body into shapes that are beyond the scope of bones, ligaments, and the range of motion. Those can sometimes result in injuries that are irreversible. So you cannot come back from these type of injuries. So it's really important to have good alignment. Your knees and elbows are meant to hinge, so flex and extend, and hinge only. So don't move your knees and elbows in directions that they are not meant to be moved in to avoid injury. The lower leg bones only rotate if they are bent, as in Virasana or Hero's pose. And for some people, they won't really rotate at all. They might not bend at all. So it's just really important to be aware of your body, aware of your limitations as well. And poses such as pigeon pose that you see here. The position of the lower leg depends on the range of motion and the position in the hip, the femur bone in the acetabulum or the socket of the ilium. So if the range of motion in the hips is limited, trying to get your lower leg bones parallel to the front of the mat will force the knee, and that could result in ligament, tendon, or other soft tissue damage. So getting into our poses, knowing our body's limitations, and working our way towards our goals in our asanas is really key, not forcing the body in any way. Okay, different asanas for bone health. So Chaturanga Dandasana, high plank. So looking here at the skeleton, you lengthen through the crown of your head, your bones stack, shoulders, elbows, wrists, spread your fingers wide, root through your full hands, and engage that Hasta Bandha. You have a slight anterior tilt in the pelvis. Your heels are stacked over your toes, and your pelvis is in line with the shoulders and heels, and you align your hips, legs, ankles, and heels. So all in alignment. So this is a really great example, and I love how it labeled everything here for us. I tried to find more of these and couldn't find more of these, but these are really a great reference. Let's move on to Vrksasana or tree pose. So flexion and extension of the knee is key. We rely on the extended legs, deep ligaments of the knee to stabilize and maintain balance in this pose. And so be sure that the pelvis is level and that your standing leg is facing forward. Don't let the hip jut out or your standing knee will collapse inward. So if your knee does not jut out, then you're probably using your ligaments and joints and you're not using your muscles. So you want to engage your muscles in tree pose. Okay. Ardha Chandrasana or half moon pose. So your bones reach out in all directions with energy extended out to bring stability in this pose. So you want to ground your foot to the floor, press back with your elevated foot, reach up with your elevated hand, and extend your head forward. Okay, Dandasana or staff pose. So for this one, your shoulder joints stabilize as you place your shoulders over your hips and ground your hands into the floor. And you can feel the bones grounding and connecting you to the floor in Dandasana or staff pose. Okay. This is extended side angle pose. So your spine needs to remain neutral as the side of the body stretches and lengthens, with the disc joints maintaining space and providing stability between the vertebrae in this pose. Then the glenohumeral joint in the lower shoulder stabilizes to carry the weight of the pose, while the upper shoulder joint keeps the arm abducted. So the knee joint in the front leg maintains flexion and keeps the knee steady and aligned in the pose. And the knee joint in the back leg is going to hold that leg in extension. Okay, I have a couple more asanas here. So warrior pose 2. So from a wide stance, you're going to rotate your left leg so that your right foot and knee turn out 90 degrees. Bend your left knee over your left heel, reach your arms actively out to your sides at shoulder height so you're abducting, and be sure your front knee does not move past the ankle. And then you want to hold for stability and balance. But remember, this is one thing that I think us as yoga teachers notice a lot. So keep your shoulders soft and relaxed and not shrugged up to your ears. And that will really help with your alignment. Okay, our last asana is dancer's pose. So dancer's pose, you want to press firmly and evenly through your feet and take a point on eye level to focus on. So your drishti point. Bend your left knee, bringing your left foot to your buttocks, and hold the outside of your left foot with your left hand. So you want to firm your right hip in, engage your right thigh and knee to make your standing leg nice and strong. And remember to keep your torso upright, your chest open, and lengthen your tailbone down. And you will have good alignment in dancer's pose. So yoga means addition of energy, strength, and beauty to body, mind, and soul. I liked that quote there. So remember, the asanas can help with strengthening, of the hips, arms, spine, and legs to create a strong skeleton. Yoga is protective in reducing fractures and spinal injuries by strengthening and increasing the agility and stability in our body. So strength builds as you hold each pose or asana. Remember that good alignment though is key. So we're going to work within the limitations of, our body at the time and work towards our goals in our asanas. And you want to feel your muscles tensing in asanas. That is how you know that you are engaging in building muscles. And when you build muscle, you build bone. So the controlled resistance used in yoga poses puts pressure on your bones, but it also strengthens them. So the push and the pull between your muscles and bones causes the body to produce more osteocytes, which are your bone making cells, and that's going to improve your bone density as you age. So yoga is great for, combating the osteoporosis as we age. So yoga provides greater flexibility, range of motion, better posture, better balance, enhanced coordination, and also reduced emotional and physical stress. So, one thing I like to always say is remember that practice makes progress. So we're always making progress in our practice. And whenever, we think we aren't, then we need to probably, realign our thinking and bring ourselves back to where we know that we are a work in progress. So we are all learning and growing in our asana practice. Keep up with the work and practice and enjoy the benefits that it's going to bring you. So from the Yoga Sutra of Patanjali, Sutra 114, practice becomes firmly grounded when well attended for a long time without break and in all earnestness. So be earnest in your practice and keep practicing every day, even if it's just for 5 minutes. But as long as you're getting a little bit in every day, you are working towards your goals. So one of the niyamas, svadhyaya or self-study. So sva meaning own self or the human soul, and adhaya meaning lesson, lecture, or reading. So I thought this was good because we have self-study is something we have to keep on a daily basis, and it's going to help us become aware of the needs of our body. So from the yamas and niyamas, self study is about knowing our true identity as divine and understanding the boxes we are wrapped in. This process of knowing ourselves and the boxes that adorn us create a pathway to freedom. Also, uh, from yamas and niyamas, these are the ways of self study to be able to look at ourselves in the mirror, to truly understand ourselves and our thought processes. Knowing that we aren't who we thought we were, begin to open up the possibilities of knowing our true self. So I think it's important to have that self study. How we structure our beliefs, ourselves, our lives. Those are all projected in our thoughts of the world and our thoughts of others. And Buddhists say that when we die, the universe dies because that is the world of our reality. So as we shift our attention to our divine selves within, our boxes of belief systems begin to fall away and we have a lot more freedom. So freedom to really look inside and be able to increase our awareness and work on our practice the way that our bodies need us to. So by paying attention to our setting ourselves, we become more aware of the things we do that harm us and also those which serve us and bring us closer to the process of yoking or uniting with our true self. And with yoga, so yoking, yoga. So studying our habits on the yoga mat can go a long way towards recognizing our habits off the mat. And the way we practice yoga is very reflective of the way that we practice life. So a person's physical yoga practice often reveals a lot more about them than they might think. So, again, self study, really paying attention to what are we doing outside of our practice off our mat. So, this quote here is from an unknown author, but I really liked it. So, watch your thoughts, they become words. Watch your words, they become actions. Watch your actions, they become habits. Watch your habits, they become character. And watch your character, for it becomes your destiny. So, Sadhya is the sense of studying ourselves in daily life, requires us to take our yoga practice off the mat. So, yoga is the journey of the self through the self to the self, the Bhagavad Gita. That's a great quote from that. And then this picture here, the practice of looking within to understand our true nature. So, our self study practice. I thought this was definitely a good connection to learning proper alignment, being able to look at ourselves through our practice and outside of our practice and really having some self-study here. So I want to say thank you. I learned a lot during the researching of this project. As I said, I think the skeletal system is fascinating, and the stability that it provides to our bodies is amazing. And so I think it's our duty to take care of our bodies. Our bodies are our temples, and we need to keep up with our asana practice. And that will, as I've shown here, really take care of our bones. It's going to take protective care of our bones. So if you have any questions about anything in my anatomy project here, let me know. Feedback is always welcome as well. I enjoyed sharing this with you, and this is a list of the sources that I used for the project. So I recommend any and all of them, especially the books, the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, the Yamas and Niyamas, which we have all read, and then the Yoga Anatomy coloring book is a great resource, and it's fun too because you can, really delve into learning yoga anatomy by assigning colors, and it's pretty fun. So thank you guys again, and namaste.